Hello. Hello, everyone. How are you doing? Right. So that's the last class before the holidays. Um, as you may have seen on the miniature. Hello. As you may have seen on the miniature, we're going to discuss the social changes during the industrial age today. And that will enable us to conclude this lesson. Hello. To conclude this lesson about the changes of due to industrialization, right? So I'm just summarizing what we've done so far. We had one lesson about the Industrial Revolution itself, okay, the way that more wealth was being produced and a change in the means of production. Hello, everybody. Hello, everyone. And hello to the people arriving right now. So we had a first lesson, a first paragraph that you have the summary of. You have a summary of this on Moodle about the industrial changes. Okay. Secondly, we have the second part, which was about the ideological changes. And that was about liberalism and the various forms of socialism, to prove that society was not only changing when it came to the means of production, but it was also changing when it came to how thinking about society and thinking what society is. And the last thing we've not done yet is this: the changes in the ways of living. Okay, the social and cultural changes. And the social and cultural changes are due to the fact that the former groups that constituted society, to say differently, the three estates that existed before the French Revolution, the nobility, the clergy, and what we call le tiers état in France, this conception was totally unsettled and transformed radically by industrialization. And this is exactly what I would like to present you with today. And there will be a summary of these two on Moodle, which means that at the end of this lesson today, at the end of the class today, and just before we go to well-deserved holidays, we will have studied the industrial changes. So it means that after the holidays, in 2 weeks, we'll be starting another lesson, okay, which will be about the diplomatic tensions growing in Europe. And we will study how the competition between the European states, between France, the UK, Germany, Russia, led to World War I. I will teach 3 hours on this, how the competition between states led or paved the way for World War I. And so in May and June, we will be studying the First World War, which, remember, you need to know for next year's syllabus. Okay, so the very reason I'm going to keep on teaching normal classes, as normal as can be, is because we need all this, and we need all the information about what led to the First World War, because next year in Terminal, and it's going to be evaluated for the back, what happened during World War I and its consequences is part of the final evaluation. Okay, so that was a general introduction, which was a bit longer, so that everybody can connect, or almost everybody, as I can see, can connect to this. I will leave this video until tomorrow or until Sunday in case you need to watch it again and take some notes. Okay, people. For today, I'm going to speak about social groups. I won't say classes. I will try and avoid the word classes because that has got a Marxist denotation, right? connotation or denotation, actually, both. I will try to use the word social groups, social categories. I will sometimes talk about social classes, especially for the bourgeoisie and the working class. Actually, in the 19th century, we're still discussing the same period, okay? The period is still 1800 and 1914, and I'm still discussing this on a European level, okay? I'm discussing this at the scale of Europe, not only France or the UK, but Europe. I will give examples taken from France and the UK mostly, but that was a European phenomenon. So, where should we start? Actually, we could split this mind map or this chart in two halves. Now you've got the dotted line here. At the top, we could say these were the declining groups. And the problem with using declining is that it's maybe too strong a word. It's not a declining, they were not declining on a regular, following a regular trend. But let's say these were the two groups which were the most affected by the Industrial Revolution. And that was first the nobles, the nobility or gentry. Okay, you can use both words, and I will explain you the difference. So the nobles, they were affected by this Industrial Revolution. And of course, the rural communities. Take care, the rural communities have not disappeared. The major impacts to the rural communities came after World War II. Okay, but it started in the 19th century. And on the contrary, you've got two social categories for which the 19th century was the booming time span. That's the bourgeoisie, okay? And this bourgeoisie was clearly the leading class, the leading group, the leading category in the Industrial Revolution, in the industrial age. And you've got the working class, which now was a more organized class. It was not new. It existed in the Middle Ages, for example. But now it constituted not only a category, but really a class. That is, people that started being aware of their situation. And in some countries, they became the majority, like in Germany, for example, or in the UK. Right? So, if we really want to have a kind of caricatural vision, which I don't like, but that will help you understand, the descending groups, the ascending groups, the slowly declining groups, the fastly increasing and more influential, getting more influential groups. Is that clear for you? Okay, so as you have studied the French Revolution for a long time, you should know this, and I'm starting here. The nobility was declining before the Industrial Revolution. The fact that the nobility was challenged did not start with the industrialization of Europe. Firstly, because of course, sorry, I've forgotten the major thing, okay? But it was challenged firstly by the French Revolution, okay? You remember the revolution abolished the privileges of, privileges of the nobility. But that's a political fact. Now I would like to show you why there was also an economic impact on the nobility. But before this, you have to remember this: the nobility remained highly influential up to World War I. Why? Because the nobility still gave most of the army officers. I'll just give you one example. When you study l'affaire Dreyfus, which happened at the end of the 19th century in France, and you look at all the officers, Gaspard can't connect. So can you tell him he'll be able to review this in case he wants to vision this again, right? It's going to stay for some time on YouTube. So if he really wants to have this, right, I can only tell him to do that. Okay, thank you for telling me. Yes, when you look at the affaire Dreyfus, when you look at the Dreyfus case, you realize something. Many officers who are mentioned in Émile Zola's article, J'accuse, when you look at their name, you can see they were from the nobility. Okay, a lot of names with particle, right? Particule, as we say in France, right? Du Paty de Clan, which was one of the major officers involved in the Dreyfus case, and so on. So why am I saying this? In Germany, for example, the generals of the Prussian army and then the German army in World War I, they were from the nobility. The generals in France or in the UK during World War I, they were from the nobility. So don't say the industrial age killed nobility. It's not true. They remain influenced in the army and in politics. But before the Industrial Revolution, wealth was coming from owning the land. Wealth was coming from being a landlord, a land proprietor. With the effects of the Industrial Revolution, suddenly the land was less worthy. I'm not saying it lost all value, right? I've never said this. I'm just saying that suddenly wealth was not coming only from the land, from owning the land and getting revenue from the land like taxes or rents or whatever. And so, of course, as the power of the nobility, as the wealth of the nobility depended on their capacity to extract revenue from the land property, their economic power declined. And this is why in several countries, that was true in the UK mostly, it was also true in Italy to some extent, and it was true but a bit later in France. It was true under Napoleon III mostly. The nobility decided to convert from being landowners to merchant activities. In the UK, it's very true that many noble families decided to invest in transport infrastructure, like, for example, train companies and so on, and also investing in regional trade and cloth trade, for example. So it means that the nobility was still there, okay, but it was less and less the ruling class. Its power as a ruling class declined before disappearing. But in the meantime, some of them adapted to the production of wealth and they converted to merchant activities. Okay? Right? So the 19th century is the history of a long-lasting declining trend in both the economic and political power of the nobility. And we could say that the actual nail in the coffin of the nobility came with World War I. Why? Because with World War I, it was now clear that the defense of a country did not rely on an elite of nobles who were officers, but it relied on the capacity of the average people, the working class, the middle class, the peasants, the technicians, the engineers, to put on a uniform and fight. And so the other thing that affected the power of the nobility is the fact that they were not as necessary as before to fight. And you know why? Because to become a good fighter in the Middle Ages or in the Renaissance, you had to practice for a long time because you needed to have swords, bows, and arrows. So you needed a long training. Now, with the modern warfare, you could learn how to use a rifle or a gun in 2 weeks and become as efficient as a trained fighter. Okay, you see? So that would be later. But so the nobility was more or as much killed by World War One as it was by the Industrial Revolution. The social role of the nobility, which was fighting at first. Are you okay with that? Do not hesitate as usual. If there is something which is not clear, please use the chat to phrase your questions. Now, this nobility was highly linked to the rural life. I've told you the nobles, they lived on the land. They lived on the wealth created by the land. And who farmed the land? The rural communities, the peasants. And this rural economy and community life was totally transformed. Why? Firstly, because the Industrial Revolution was also an agricultural revolution. Mechanization came little by little. The use of fertilizers, the use of steel tools instead of wooden tools. The fact that, for example, that's something which is not thought of a lot. Everybody knows about Pasteur, everybody knows about the vaccination, everybody knows about the medical care for humans. But the improvement of medicine also improved the health of animals. When you were a breeder, when you were breeding cows or pigs, or when you were using them as beasts of burden, right? Horses, for example, were used to pull the plow. These animals also lived longer and were stronger because the medical care, the veterinary care also developed. So it means that you needed fewer workers to produce the same amount of food. And that led to many peasants moving to industrial town. So you've got this word called rural exodus or rural exodus or rural flight. Let's say it's migration to industrial towns. And who was affected? The youth. The young rurals were looking for jobs in the city because their hands, their labor was less and less needed in the fields. So they moved to cities. And the problem is that by moving to cities, they also cut links with their ways of living. When you lived in a rural community before the industrial age, you would never leave it or barely leave it, right? Only for short periods and generally never. Secondly, your personal destiny was rather clear. You would, if you'd marry, you would marry with someone that was in your surrounding, okay, community surrounding. It could be someone from the next hamlet or village, but barely farther away than this. Your life would be very well structured by regular moments, the seasons, the celebrations, which were mostly religious celebrations, the local celebrations for specific moments related to agriculture, right? The harvest, the moments, the winter was a specific moment with a low activity. What I mean is that when you were a farmer, you had a life which depended on seasons a lot. When you moved to the city, suddenly your life was not regulated by the seasons, it was regulated and structured by factory time. And you know what? factory time never ceases. It never stops. You can work in factories in the winter as in the summer. You don't need the sunlight to work. You have artificial light. So what I mean is that it transformed the conception of life too. What also transformed rural communities is that schooling became compulsory, became an obligation and a duty both in the city and in the countryside. Okay, everybody knows about Jules Ferry in France. Okay, and the school laws by Jules Ferry, they were implemented in 1876 and 77, and they started being implemented in the 1880s. What does that mean? It means that now, even when you were a rural dweller, you would receive the same culture as those in the urban environment. Why? Because in France, for example, you had national curricula, national programs, which were decided in Paris. So it means that the vision of France and the vision of society was now diffused to everyone, including the rurals, through schooling and literacy. Okay? Finally, many rural communities used to be isolated. When you were living in the mountains, for example, when you were living in the Alps, or when you were living in the Massif Central, or when you were living in the highlands in Scotland, it could take days between you and the closest urban center. I just give this example that you certainly know. In France, the départements were created by the French Revolution. And in each département, you had a préfecture and sous-préfecture. Why did that exist? Because the aim of the revolutionary was to say no citizen should walk for more than one day, walk or ride a horse for more than one day to reach the préfet or sub-préfect. Préfet ou sous-préfet. So it means that at the end of the 18th century, it could take at least one day just to go to a major urban center. Now, at the end of the 19th century, one century later, many rural communities started being connected because transportation was changing the link between the distant communities and the cities. Okay? That's very important, for example, to remember this. Sorry, it's there. I'm on the wrong side. My bad. I was showing you the wrong side. At the end of the 19th century, in almost every place in France, you could now receive a newspaper that had been published in Paris the day before or 2 days before. At the time of the French Revolution, globally, it would take 2 weeks for someone living in the Alps or someone living in the Pyrenees or someone living in the center of Brittany, the most beautiful place on earth, or someone living in La Sologne, right? Maybe it would take 10 to 15 days to get a newspaper published in Paris. At the end of the period, at the end of the 19th century, suddenly, yeah, you can relate, right? It would only take 24 or 48 hours. And so it means that as many newspapers were published in cities, the rural life also was affected. What am I trying to tell you by this? I'm trying to tell you that the two groups which had developed specific cultures, specific lifestyles, a specific way of life before the Industrial Revolution. And these two groups, they defined Europe. These two groups, they defined what Europe was before the Industrial Revolution. Little by little, these two groups were losing their economic importance and, as a consequence, their cultural importance. The 19th century was the moment when cities spread to the countryside. When I say they spread to the countryside, I'm not only saying they spread, they sprawled. I'm also saying their culture, their ways of living, their lifestyles started gradually, right? It was a slight thing at first. I'm not saying that brutally any farmer became a trendy urban practitioner. No, I'm just saying that little by little, the bourgeois culture, the urban culture, spread its influence over Europe. Okay? Right? Good. If you look at what I've drawn here, you can see this. When I told you that there was more connection between the rural life and the urban life, when I told you that the nobility was starting converting to merchant activities, that's exactly what I was trying to prove. And if you look at this, these are urban activities connected to what? Connected to the urban categories. Okay? So let's focus on the rising class in the 19th century, the bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie. So the bourgeoisie was not a new class. It had globally expanded since the Middle Ages. It is generally agreed upon by the historians that the bourgeoisie developed in the 12th, started developing in the 12th centuries. It started, just a brief historical reminder, I won't teach a lesson about the rising, the medieval rising of the bourgeoisie, though it would be a absolutely exciting lesson because it's quite interesting. But okay, so hello Gaspar anyway, sorry for this. If you can't see me, it's not a problem. If you can't hear, it's more of a problem, actually. I'm sorry for this. The bourgeoisie appeared, I was looking for this. The bourgeoisie appeared in the 12th century. It started in towns, okay? I mean, the French word bourgeois means the one who lives in le bourg. And le bourg is a town, a small city, okay? So what is a bourgeois at first? It's someone who had commercial activities in cities. And these people started developing in the 12th century. Then they grew in the Renaissance, in Italy, for example, or in commercial cities, in merchant cities like in Paris, in Lyon, in many German cities, in London to a smaller extent. In northern Italy was really the place where it developed. And of course, this group boomed in the Industrial Revolution because they were the one who took advantage of the ideology of entrepreneurship. Many bourgeois became what you call industrialists. They invested in industries. They invested in factories. They invested in the production of textile, metal, chemicals, and so on. And they were those who also provided the skilled jobs, the overlookers in a factory, the engineers for factories, the lawyers who were working on the legal questions in the economy, the managers, what you would call the managers today, in these factories. So the bourgeoisie was really the class that took advantage from the Industrial Revolution. Okay, it's fine, Gaspard. Don't worry. It's a pleasure having you even late. So do not hesitate to review and revision the live. I will let it on YouTube, right? So if you want to check what I've said first, you will find this, no problem. So now, what was a bourgeois in the Middle Ages? Someone living in the city. What was a bourgeois in the industrial age? It was someone with at least some secondary education, if you want to write this. To be a bourgeois, to belong to the bourgeoisie, you needed a secondary education. Most of the bourgeoisie had gone beyond the certificat d'études, for example, in France, or beyond primary school. You needed to go to some high school or higher school or middle school. So that's something. Secondly, you needed to have some capital. And this capital could be financial capital, okay? Or, as I've told you, educational capital. Something which was not only selling your force, but also you're selling some intellectual or literary capacities. Thirdly, it meant that your revenues enabled you to be the proprietor of your home. This is a definition which could be a good definition of being a bourgeois. You had little difficulty, if no difficulty at all, living in your home, in your own house. In some places at the end of the 19th century, workers could be able to do that. But that was because there were reforms. But in 1850 or in 1860, being the owner of your home was a sign of being a bourgeois. So, of course, the bigger your home, the higher a bourgeois you were, right? But that means that when you were, for example, a primary school teacher, you belong to the petit bourgeoisie. The petit bourgeoisie, P-E-T-T-Y. I'm not writing it because I don't want to overload my scheme. Petit bourgeoisie means you earn more than a worker. You have your own home, your own flat. Your revenues are not very high, but they're still higher than the workers. And also, there is something more. You have specific bourgeois values. The bourgeoisie diffused its values in the new society. And what were these values? Can we go back to what the values before the industrial times were? Once again, I'm being a bit maybe caricatural. I know that there is much more nuance to what I'm saying, right? But to make things clear for you, in the pre-industrial times, work was a bad word in the French nobility. It was a bad word because if you had to work, it meant that you didn't have enough land to have farmers working for you. If you look at the two ruling classes of society before the French Revolution, the nobility didn't work, and the clergy did not work like with their hands and so on. They were praying. They had a role, but it was not work. If you want to make a bit of etymology, just, I'm sure some of you know this. That's Latin. Otium means free time or doing nothing. In French, that's given oisiveté. Otium means that's all the time you have because you don't have to work. And that's good. What is neg otium? When you don't have the time. And this has given negotiate, which in France, what is a négociant? It's a merchant. It's someone who has to work. So that's negative. Negative. Negocium or negotiating means working, and that's bad. It means you don't have free time. That was the nobility. That was the nobility state of mind. Just think of the French nobles with the... yes, absolutely. Otium is like idleness. Absolutely. Otium is when you're idle. That's exactly it. Okay? L'oisiveté. Idleness in English. Very good. That's it. So what does that mean? It means that... I'll give you just another example. So it's going to be in French, sorry, but in French we had this. It used to be a bad word. It used to be a smear. It was called pâle sang bleu. I know that today if you say pâle sang bleu, you will look ridiculous or sound ridiculous. That means par le sang bleu. And le sang bleu was supposed to be the blood of the nobles. Why? Because as they didn't work, their skin was very clear, was very white, was pale. And the paler the skin, the more noble you were. Okay? So if you had le sang bleu, you were a noble because we could see your veins because your skin was pale. So that was a way to prove that working was bad. Working was for slaves and peasants. Working was for slaves and peasants. The dream life of a noble was a life of idleness. The bourgeoisie totally broke this conception by bringing two things into the game. And the first one was the work ethic. Work ethics is a major invention by the bourgeoisie. And this is very compatible. This is highly related to liberalism. You get what you deserve. The harder you work, the more you earn. If you don't earn enough, it's because you've not worked enough. And you can see how these work ethics have totally invaded our society today. It has invaded society so much that even in times of holidays, we have to go into vacances apprenantes because we have to work more. Okay, even when there is no class, you have to work. Let's do this QCM. Okay, so, and I'm not saying it's bad, right? I'm not saying it's bad and we should reject it. I'm just saying that clearly the difference is that the ruling class before the industrial age promoted work, but not for itself. They promoted work for slaves, peasants, tradesmen, and so on, but not for itself. Now, the bourgeoisie was promoting work for everyone, including itself. Okay? No, not same idea. So to answer your question, not same idea as being a blue collar, because a blue collar was related to the type of outfits the workers would wear. When you were blue blood, when you had blue blood, Your veins, okay, all over your arms and legs could be seen because you never went out. Because going out was for the farmers, the peasants, okay? Blue color is due to, it's the type of protective outfit, generally a cotton, a blue dyed cotton outfit that you would wear in the factories. So being blue color means you're a worker, and a worker generally in either in a workshop or in a car manufacturing factory or whatever. Okay. So the second notion is the notion of respectability. You're welcome. Respectability. You have to have a respectable life. The nobility, they did not really care about respectability. They were nobles. They didn't have to care. They were born respectable, or they were born nobles. The bourgeoisie said being respectable means that you have to promote values. So even if you earn a lot of money, contrary to the nobles who were willing to show it, the nobles wanted to show how rich they were. They organized huge parties. They built huge castles. The bourgeoisie was rather more on working ethics, saying what is important is working. It's important to earn money, but you should not show it too much. For example, this is what you call the Victorian age. That's the Victorian values in England. And the Victorian values were based on something called the etiquette. What is the etiquette? It's how you should live properly, how you should respect people who are more respectable than you, okay? How you should also adopt clear social behaviors. The etiquette is how you address someone, okay? And you should give the proper title to this person. The etiquette, you want an example of what the etiquette was? I give you one. And you will see that it has left a lot of impact on today's society. The etiquette was that in a factory, when the boss, owner, crossed the path of a worker, when the boss crossed the path of a worker, the worker should salute first, and then the boss would render back, would salute back. Never the other way round. Never the other way around. Okay? The worker owes a salute to the boss, and the boss is happy to respond, but he should never say hello first, because that's not his role. And maybe you know this, that it is still believed that, for example, I know some colleagues who defend this, that when a teacher meets a pupil, the pupil should say hello first. Should actually say good morning, sir, first. Okay, that's respectability. That's the etiquette. That's the etiquette. I should wait for you saying me hello, and then maybe I will answer because I have some duties. Okay, and that's still something very common. When a proviseur gets into the classroom and you all stand up, that's absolutely bourgeois etiquette. I'm not saying it has nothing to do with the nobility etiquette, right? When the king was entering somewhere, right? But now you see that it was transmitted to any person that could be in your upper position, right? When Monsieur Blanquer, if Monsieur Blanquer ever comes to visit the high school and he enters the room, I should stand up because he's my supervisor. Okay, good. So that's what you call the etiquette, and in the UK, that would give the Victorian values. The Victorian values. I give you another example of etiquette. When you're a young lady, a young girl in the bourgeoisie, you have a chaperone. You have a lady who's in charge of you in case you go out, in case you meet new people, especially boys, because that would not be respectable from you. That would not be respectable from you to meet someone outside the family without being supervised by a chaperone. Okay, and you've got a lot of guides that were written, good education guides that were written in the 19th century in the UK under Queen Victoria's reign. Queen Victoria, just for your information, Queen Victoria, she ruled from right. She was born in 1819. She ruled from 1837 to 1901. So as you can see, she ruled for 64-year-old. Only Elizabeth II has reigned longer, right? But it means that she ruled for 2/3 of the 19th century. So she really was the embodiment, Queen Victoria, she really was the embodiment of these new values. She was very austere, for example, right? It was not fun being Queen Victoria, and she never promoted something funny. And that was exactly what the type of value the bourgeoisie would promote, Life is for working, life is for being respectable, and so on, right? So all this, of course, was related to being urban. It was an urban life with new networks of sociability. What were these networks of sociability? The clubs, for example. Not clubs like nightclubs, okay? Clubs like places, so networks of sociability, places where you would meet your fellow bourgeois, your fellow industrialist, your fellow whatever category you want, okay, university teachers and professors and so on. Okay, good, right. Oh, I'm not too bad on time. Finally, something I've already discussed to some extent. The last group, the fastest booming, the fastest growing group, the factory workers. They were the fastest growing group. Okay. Sorry, can you rephrase your question about just like at the end of the 18th century in France? When you talk about networks of sociability? Yeah, absolutely. The same type of clubs, but the difference was that instead of being intellectual clubs, which was the case at the 18th century in France, now there were more clubs to, belong to okay, I understand your question. The difference was that these clubs were more clubs for specific types of networks, which was more about practicing sports, practicing leisure, right? Playing cards, for example, playing whist, or playing some type of card games, or smokers clubs, or gamblers clubs. But that was done with people not gambling. Gambling is not moral. It does not correspond to the work ethics. So it was more to keep the sociability of these new bourgeoisie. Whereas at the end of the 18th century in France, most of them were intellectual clubs. That was not always the case. That was actually barely the case for the bourgeois club, even if some of them were involved in intellectual activity. Okay? So, if you want just a comparison or between the beginning and the end of the period, that's something you may write. In a country like, you're welcome, in a country like Germany, I'm talking about this, right? The fastest growing group. In a country like Germany, at the beginning of the 19th century, the working class, the workers in manufactories, represented something like 8% of the German population. At the end of the 19th century, 1 century later, they represented more than 1/3 of the population. So from being a minority group, and a small minority group, less than 8%, to being the major, it was not a majority, but being the major group in the German society. Another example, in the UK, the manufactory workers represented 20% of the population of Manchester at the beginning of the 19th century. They represented 65% of the population of Manchester at the end of the century. So clearly, that was by far the fastest growing group. They too, as the bourgeoisie, were the urban dwellers, okay? They participated to the urbanization of culture, the urbanization of lifestyles. And the best example you may get, for example, is that if you think of France, maybe, you've got all the cabaret, the music halls, and so on. And part of them were for the middle class, part of them were for the working class. Okay, in the bourgeoisie, you have different levels, and the middle class is the bottom of the bourgeoisie. It's the petit bourgeoisie. But if you've ever heard of a painter called Toulouse-Lautrec, Toulouse-Lautrec is very famous for having painting posters of the cabaret in Paris and the pubs and cafes in Paris. And these pubs and cafes, they were for the working class. Okay, right. As you know, these working class represented a difficulty, a major one, and that was the housing problem. Why? Because many cities were not able to build as many proper homes, decent homes, equipped homes for the amount of workers massively coming to towns. And the way they were housed, the poor state of their housing was a major concern. Most workers in Paris, most workers in Manchester, most workers in Glasgow, most workers in Berlin, most workers in Bilbao, which was one of the first cities to develop in Spain, were living in slums. They were living in flats. They were living in homes that were actually not decent, which created a real health problem. You had epidemics of cholera in Glasgow at the end of the 19th century, and corpses, dead bodies, were evacuated by the hundreds from buildings and lots. Okay? That means that little by little, the workers became a major social concern. And it became a concern for both the socialists, I've already mentioned this, people who cared about the situation and the fate of the workers, but more and more, it became a concern and a worry for the ruling classes, for the bourgeoisie. Why? Because they were afraid that maybe if workers managed to organize and to demand and press for better living conditions, then it could create political trouble. So the working class became a growing social concern in politics, both by the socialist parties and by the bourgeois party. Okay? Right. Finally, these workers organized more and more. And they organized in trade unions. And these trade unions would become a very important protagonist in the 20th century. It took very different form in the UK and in France. In the UK, as in Germany, but mostly in the UK, trade unions were concerned by the working conditions to be improved, which means that in the UK, there is a tradition of trade unions being more into negotiations, using strikes, using demonstration, using any kind of means of struggle, not to get rid of the capitalist system, not necessarily to get rid of capitalism, but more to get better conditions within the capitalist system. And this is what trade unionism in the UK is more inclined to being reformist. It's more inclined to say, we won't get rid of capitalism. Why? Because capitalism can be good for us because it creates wealth. What we want is a larger share, a larger portion, a larger distribution of the wealth. So we're getting into strikes, we're getting into organization to get those. In France, in Italy, to some extent in Germany at that time, but mostly in France and Italy, trade unions tended to be more revolutionary. They were seen as a way, I've mentioned Fernand Pelloutier on the other day, they were more inclined to go into strikes so that it would crush capitalism. So in the UK, a reformist tendency. In France, a more revolutionary tendency. And one element to understand what happened in the 20th century is that this working class would get more and more political influence. This is the reason why you had the Bolshevik Revolution in the USSR, and that's something we study this year and at the beginning of next year. This is why you had the Front Populaire in France, and that's something that will be next year syllabus. This is why after World War II, in the Cold War, winning the hearts of the working class, whether you were a liberal, like a US incline, or whether you were a Bolshevik or communist incline or Soviet incline political party, would be at the heart of the political systems. This role of the working class would then diminish in the 1970s. Why? Because the middle class was rising. Okay, the middle class was rising. But the 19th century was really the moment when the working class grew fast, got more and more political influence, organized with the trade unions. And so the new balance of power in society in Europe would come between this group, the bourgeoisie, with all its level, that means the upper bourgeoisie, Rothschild, Schneider in Le Creusot, the Barclays bankers in London, right? That's the upper bourgeoisie. Then the bourgeoisie itself, like people who were the owners of firms. Then the petit bourgeoisie, or the middle class, the upper middle class, the petit bourgeoisie, the doctors, the teachers, the clerks, okay? And these people, and were not opposing, but they had different interests from the working class. And so how you should balance the interest of the bourgeoisie and the interest of the working class would be a major challenge both in the 19th century and in the 20th. And just as a conclusion, because time is up, you know, when these two groups would meet a lot, they would meet a lot in the trenches. They would meet a lot in the trenches of World War I. Because when you're stuck for months and weeks, and I'm sorry for what I'm about to say because it's not very nice, but when you're stuck there and everybody risked to die, whether you were a former engineer or a former farmer or a former factory worker, when you piece yourself because you can't leave the trench, when you're full of your comrades' blood and guts because the guy next to you got a shell in the belly and he's all burst all over, when your life depends on the bourgeois next to you because you're a worker, or your life depends on the worker next to you because you're a bourgeois and you have to fight together, that certainly created some specific spirit. But globally, you see what I'm doing here. I'm still sowing seeds for the study of World War I. And that's something that has been much studied by historians. Like, were people that united in the trenches? Okay, and depending on your social group and your social category or class. Okay, right. Here we are. I am done for this presentation. Okay. I was a bit fast on all this because I really wanted to conclude this lesson before the holidays. But don't worry, you'll get a much more comprehensive vision in the summary. Right. So scientists belong to the bourgeoisie because if you remember what I've told you, to be in the bourgeoisie, you needed some education, some secondary education. So scientists were in the bourgeoisie. They had a very important role because bourgeoisie also believed in the social progress and intellectual progress. So clearly, many scientists belong to the middle or upper bourgeoisie. Being a science professor in a university was a well-respected, highly respectable profession. Still, their salaries or their revenue made them bourgeois, but not upper bourgeois. The scientists were mostly considered in the middle range of the bourgeoisie. Okay, they were not in the upper range. The upper range of the bourgeoisie were the bankers. They were the owners of large corporations, large industries. But scientists were considered, but not. When people say, oh, we should pay the scientists much more than we do, that's not a new debate. Even in the 19th century, a physics professor in the university, a biology professor in the university would never gain and earn as much money as a high bourgeois. Okay? Right? Good. So that will be on Moodle. And during the weekend, I will also complete the whole paper. So paper will have 3 parts. Part 1, the economic changes. You have it already. Part 2 and 3, the social and ideological changes that we have studied already. Okay? Then we have a break, a 2-week break. Nothing to do during these 2 weeks. But after the holidays, we'll be back for... either we go back to high school. I doubt it. Not immediately, I guess. Or we keep on with this method. And so I will certainly do the same. That is one class on Monday and 1 class on Friday. But you'll get some news from me before this, during the 2nd week of the holidays. Okay? Are there any questions, or are there any remark or anything you'd like to say or write? No? It's okay? So I'm down. Right, people, really try and make sure you get some good holidays. Try to, unplug and do something clever like reading poetry by Caroline Duffy or any other poetress uh, or any other book or okay. So take great care of yourself and see you in 2 weeks. Okay, bye. See you.